Okay, right. So nematodes and nematomorphs are part of this superphylum or super duper phylum. There's really no established name for the ranks, and there probably don't need to be ranks above the phylum level. But whatever you call it, this supergroup is the Ecdysozoa. You might remember that ecdysis means molting. These are organisms that have a chitin cuticle, and they periodically molt it. The molt is under hormonal control. Typically, they molt it a fixed number of times. And this includes the nematodes, which we've talked about at some length. And we took a quick look at the nematomorphs on Monday. There's several smaller phyla that are sometimes grouped in a group called the Scalidophora. These are all marine, mostly pretty obscure. You're not likely to ever encounter chinorhynchs or loriciferans or priapulids unless you deliberately go looking for them. Most of them are near microscopic in size, and as far as I know, none are known to be parasitic, although they're not that well understood. You know, there's always room for surprises. So we won't talk about scalidopherans here. Onychophora is a clade called velvet worms. They're the only phylum that is entirely terrestrial. They look a little bit like caterpillars, although they aren't. For one thing, they are predators that can trap their prey by shooting out jets of slime from these little slime cannons in their heads. Kind of a neat trick. They're native to tropical areas. We don't have any in Arkansas. The closest you might get might be Costa Rica or something like that. And there aren't any parasitic onychophorans. That leaves the tardigrades, affectionately known as the water bears, and my favorite phylum, which I fortunately have an excuse to talk about in here, and the arthropods, by far the largest phylum with something like 3/4 of all known animal species. This is the one that includes the crustaceans and the insects and the arachnids and a number of others. Lots of parasites in the arthropoda. In fact, that'll occupy most of the rest of the course. So tardigrades, you could actually find around here. They're near microscopic in size, although the big ones might reach a millimeter, maybe even a little bigger. They're covered in a chitinous body covering, and they periodically molt it. The body's divided into exactly 4 segments plus a head. Each segment has a pair of legs that has claws on the tips. The mouth looks a little bit nematode-like in that these have tube-like mouths that are primarily for sucking. Back of the tube-like mouth, there's generally a muscular pharynx, looking kind of like a muscular medicine dropper bulb used for sucking liquids in. And there's a pair of piercing stylets in the mouth, little needle-like objects that can be extruded. Some tardigrades feed on algae. Some would feed on smaller invertebrates. Some slurp up bacteria. All of them would use those stylets to pierce whatever it is they're going to eat and then slurp up whatever they've got. There's not much of a body cavity. The sexes are separate. And this is an anatomical diagram of one of them. The digestive system's in brown. The mouth is over on the right-hand side. You can see that narrow tube-shaped mouth leads back to a big oval bulb. That leads back to a stomach and ultimately an anus. This is a female, so you've got an ovary. Sexes are typically separate, I think. The nervous system's in green. The nervous system forms a ring that the gut actually passes through. They've got kind of a donut-shaped brain. with eyes and little nerve ganglia in each one of the segments. And you can see the legs end in little claws. What makes this not an arthropod is that arthropods have legs that are jointed. These have legs that are kind of shaped like a lobe, and they're not jointed like, plate armor would be. They don't bend at particular spots. They're, I don't know, I keep coming back to the Michelin Man. I don't know if that's a perfect comparison. In salmon pink, you've got the muscular system, and this is something you'll see in arthropods as well. The muscles are intrinsic. If you think about your own body, you've got bones on the insides of your arms, legs, and much of the rest of you, muscles attached to the bones, and they pull on the bones from outside the bone. Right? The bones are on the inside, and then muscles surround the bones, muscles attached to the bones, and muscles cause your joints to move by pulling on the bones from the outside. That's called extrinsic musculature. In tardigrades and also in arthropods, the muscles attached to the exoskeleton, or the cuticle, I should probably say, the muscles attached to the cuticle, and they pull it from the inside, not from the outside. That's called intrinsic musculature. You can see it diagrammed here, and it's definitely something you see in the arthropods. I didn't take this picture, but I found this genus creeping around in some nice lichen on a particular tree in the nature reserve. This is one called Echeniscus. You can see the legs with the claws. In Echeniscus, every leg has 4 claws. In other species, they look different. Claws are actually important for identifying species of tardigrade, if you're into that. In this particular species, the body has this very thick cuticle that forms these armor plates. Other species are not nearly so well armored. The body's a lot more flexible, and the cuticle is not divided into plates like this. This is kind of your panzer tardigrade. I should mention, it's not really relevant for parasitology, but I should mention that land-dwelling tardigrades are some of the most resistant animals. If they're, Fern, get off. If they're in a habitat that isn't favorable, they can dry out. They can lose all of their water. They've got ways of protecting their DNA and other molecules from denaturing. And in that dried out resistant state, they are extremely tough. Now, I sometimes get people who've heard about this and they think that live tardigrades are indestructible. And the answer is no, they're not. They're not made of, titanium or tungsten steel or anything. You can kill them pretty easily. But if you give them a chance to go into this resistant stage, at least some species, not necessarily all, can survive freezing, can survive boiling, can survive hard vacuum, can survive hard X-rays and other forms of radiation. And then they'll come back to life if you just add water. They'll rehydrate, and after about an hour, you'll have live tardigrades crawling around. This is a great feat of cryptobiosis, the ability to go into suspended animation when conditions are tough and then pick up where you left off. They probably could not survive on the surface of Mars or something like that, be it said, but they have survived at least brief periods in space. These have been flown on various space missions in the past, and as long as they're in that resistant state, they can survive at least for a short time in space. Very cool critters. Oh, come on. There we go. Okay. That's a view of the head. You can see there's prominent eyes. You can see, I trust, the tube-like mouth. And on either side of the mouth, there's what looks like the arms of a triangle. Those are the stylets that can be kind of levered forward and poke out of the mouth or retracted back in. And then close to the stylets in the picture on the left and farther away in the picture on the right, there's an oval-looking thing. That's that sucking bulb. That's the muscular bulb that generates sucking force to pull food in through that little tube-like mouth. And as I mentioned, many tardigrades will eat bacteria. Some can prey on larger invertebrates. Some of them can pierce cells of algae and slurp the contents out. And I get to talk about them because there are exactly 2 known parasitic tardigrades, and this happens to be one of them. Tardigrades are fairly common on land and in freshwaters, but there are marine tardigrades as well, not as well studied as the ones on land. And Tetracantron synaptae happens to be an ectoparasite of sea cucumbers, using its stylets, I presume, to pierce the skin of sea cucumbers and slurp out the contents. The body shape is broad and flattened, almost turtle-like, which you might expect for a critter that's living clamped on to the outside of something else. Is probably going to have a low profile and a wide body to make lots of contact with the surface that it's hanging onto. So that, thanks to Tetracantron, I get to slip in a mention of tardigrades in here because they are truly awesome. And I can't even remember what the other parasitic tardigrade does. But yeah, if you're ever looking at career options, it really wouldn't take too much work to become the world expert on parasitic tardigrades. Hey, I give career advice. It's not necessarily good advice, but it's advice, and it's free. Right. Arthropoda. 3/4 of all animal species, over 1 million described. The true number on Earth is probably many times that. The great majority of undiscovered arthropod species, of undiscovered animal species, are probably arthropods. Just to give you an idea, there was an entomologist about 100 years ago who was studying, I think it was leafhoppers, and he had so many new species to describe, he was starting to name them things like, I can't remember the genus, but it was something like Sedusa bobana, Sedusa cocana, C. dodana, C. fofana, C. gogana, C. hohana, and so on. And these are all, no named species, and there's so many of them that he basically had to play the name game to come up with names for all of them. That might give you a slight idea of how many flipping arthropods there are. And their ecology is almost anywhere you can think of. There are marine arthropods ranging from the intertidal rocks all the way down to the abyss, the deepest part of the ocean. There's plenty of freshwater arthropods, everything from crawfish to freshwater shrimp to insect larvae to little microscopic things like copepods and ostracods. And of course, there's terrestrial arthropods, not just insects, but arachnids, spiders and scorpions and mites and all that, and even a few terrestrial crustaceans, roly-polies, for example. And extending their reach even further, the only invertebrates capable of sustained powered flight are the insects. Although squid can actually jet propel themselves out of the water for at least relatively short distances. Insects are the only ones that have mastered flight. Some species can even migrate for thousands of miles, like the monarch butterfly. What makes them so diverse, or what makes it possible for them to be so diverse, is an extremely adaptable body plan, one that gives them a great deal of literal and figurative flexibility. The cuticle can be very thin and very flexible on something like the gills of a crawfish, for example. It's extremely thin, but it's often a lot thicker. It frequently forms an exoskeleton that's hard, and of course the cuticle periodically has to be molted. The cuticle may be tanned, meaning that the chitin ends up cross-linking with certain proteins. This is what you get in your typical insect. If you've ever seen an insect molt, they're extremely soft when they come out and they look white, and then the exoskeleton firms up and turns brown. That's that tanning process, and that tends to make the exoskeleton much harder. In many, the cuticle may also be strengthened with calcium carbonate. Lobsters and crabs, for instance, have such hard shells. That's the cuticle that's strengthened with calcium carbonate. And as in nematodes, the growth stage between molts is called an instar. So we can talk about a first instar cockroach larva, or a third instar bug juvenile, or something like that. And there's typically a fixed number of instars before you reach adulthood. What gives arthropods their name is that the appendages are jointed. That cuticle is often very stiff, but there are soft patches on the appendages that enable legs to bend, a little bit like plate armor on a medieval knight. And the muscles attach to the inner side of the cuticle and move the move the limbs around from the interior. This is called intrinsic musculature, as we talked about just a minute ago. And the muscles usually attach to infoldings of the exoskeleton called apodemes. So the appendages are divided into joints. The bodies are also segmented. And except for things like centipedes and millipedes, the body usually shows some degree of grouping segments into larger units. Insects, for example, consist of 13 segments, 5 of which make up the head, another 3 of which make up the thorax, and the rest make up the abdomen. That grouping of segments into larger functional units is called tagmosis. Another example would be on lobsters or crawfish. There's a group of segments at the front of the body that's grouped together to make what's called the cephalothorax. That's the front part of the crawfish that has the legs on it. If you eat boiled crawfish like they do in South Louisiana, they just call that the head. And then behind the head, you've got the tail. That's the long part with a number of joints on it. This is the main part that you eat if you're eating lobster or boiled crawfish. So that cephalothorax and that abdomen would be examples of tagmata, and the entire grouping of segments into larger units is called tagmosis. Right, there's a diagram of the cuticle, and the details vary quite a lot. But typically there's an outermost layer called the epicuticle, which in insects is coated in lipids, usually waxes. Handy home hint, one way of getting rid of bugs is to scatter a powder that you can get at pool supply stores called diatomaceous earth. Diatomaceous earth is actually a fossil deposit made up of the silica skeletons of microscopic algae. And if you make your average insect crawl through diatomaceous earth, it will actually sand off that epicuticle, and the insect will start losing water and hopefully die. So the epicuticle is the part on the very far outside. There's a middle layer called the exocuticle, which is very thin. And then beneath that, the crosshatched bit is the endocuticle. The cuticle may be very flexible. Proteins may cross-link to give you something stiffer, like they do in many insects that go crunch when you bite their heads off. Or the cuticle might be hardened with calcium carbonate. And when it's time to molt, there's the ordinary cuticle on the left. At the center, what you can see is that endocuticle has detached from the epithelium, and glands in the cells underneath, the molting glands, are secreting enzymes that are breaking that old endocuticle down. So that area that's covered in little speckles, that represents enzymes being secreted from that kind of flask-shaped gland, breaking down the endocuticle and causing it to separate. Usually the cuticle will break at this time, and there's usually weak points where the entire cuticle will split, allowing the animal to crawl out from underneath. And then they also secrete new cuticle from underneath. All of those cells that you see on the lower layer are secreting new layers of epicuticle. And this sclerotizes very quickly so that it doesn't get digested by the same enzymes that are breaking the old cuticle down. And that's what it looks like. On the right, that white insect is the actual insect. That's an insect juvenile of some sort. I'm honestly not sure what. But on the left, the brown thing that you see is the old cuticle that the arthropod has shed. If you have hung around in Arkansas during the summer, I have assumed that you've seen cicadas doing exactly this, or at least found those shed epicuticles and stuck them on your nose and run around freaking out your kid sister. Or at least that's what I always did. And the new cuticle may have to be stretched a bit before it finally sclerotizes. So that's how molting gets done. The leg musculature is intrinsic, and there's a cross-section of an arthropod, and you can see those strands of muscle that are attached to the inside of the body and running into that hole. They're going to attach to the exoskeleton in that first leg joint, and then when they contract, they will pull the leg joint either one direction or the other. Now, I'm not going to demonstrate this in lab, but you ought to try it yourself sometime. The summer after I'd taken invertebrate zoology for the first time, I'd learned all about apodemes, and I was on a family trip, and we stopped at the Red Lobster in Springfield, Missouri. I'm not really sure I can recommend eating seafood in a place where you can't smell the ocean. But there it was. We were hungry, and the food wasn't too bad. You know, those Cheddar Bay biscuits are pretty awesome. And I think we ordered some Alaskan crab legs as an appetizer. And I'm sure you've seen these before. You steam them, and then you use a nutcracker to crack the calcium carbonate reinforced exoskeleton, and you can pick out the meat with little forks. And I did this on one of the joints, and I managed to crack it in such a way that once I pulled all of the muscle out, there were a couple of little tough things that looked like plastic strips sticking out of the leg. And I held up the leg and I pulled on one of those strips and the leg bent in one direction. And then I pulled on the other of the strips and the leg bent in the opposite direction. And so I alternated pulling on these strips, first one and then the other, to make the leg bend back and forth. And yeah, nobody wanted to sit close to us because I was doing this weird kind of Muppet show with steamed crab legs in the middle of Red Lobster. What I was pulling on was apodemes. Apodemes are inward folds of the cuticle. In this picture, the apodeme has been stained blue. It's that light blue thing just a little bit down and to the right of the center of this picture. And then on either side of it, you can see white fibrous stuff attaching to the apodeme. That's muscle. So the muscles attached to apodemes inside the cuticle. Some of these are very useful for locomotion because they may be elastic enough that they can store elastic energy. When you run, your Achilles tendon can actually stretch and then snap back and release a certain amount of energy so you run more efficiently and run with a bit of a spring, literally a spring in your step. Apodemes can do that too. And I won't go into the details of this, but depending on how the muscles and the apodemes are arranged, the insect might be optimizing either speed or power. And it's actually analogous to the ways that muscle fibers are arranged in your own muscles. If you arrange your muscle fibers in kind of a diagonal arrangement, you can maximize power. If they're in a more longitudinal arrangement, I think you maximize speed. I'm not going to go into that further, but there's a lot of different ways you can arrange muscles and apodemes to generate whatever forces you need. Finally, tagmosis. In evolution, the earliest arthropods would have been segmented things with most or all of their segments the same, like the thing labeled onychophoran up there at the top. What has happened is that different segments can optimize for different things. So, for example, going from an ancestor that would have looked like a centipede to a fruit fly, some of those legs get modified and used as mouth parts. Some of them get modified and used as antennae. Some of them you can't really see in this picture, but they kind of turn inwards and end up as part of the reproductive system. They end up as genitals. Some of them are lost. Some of them get large. Parts, I won't go into exactly how because I don't think we fully understand, but parts of the legs, parts of the leg joint end up getting modified and becoming wings, probably. So the point is you can start with something like what's labeled onychophoran up there and specialize different segments to do different things. And furthermore, group adjacent segments together into larger units. And the larger units are called tagmata. The singular is a tagma. And the pattern that they use is called tagmosis. So, for example, in insects like the fruit fly that you see, the head is actually made up of, I believe it's 5 segments that are so tightly glommed together that you really can't see that they used to be separate segments unless you follow the embryology very carefully. And then the mid part of the body, the thorax, is the part that's got the wings and the legs. That's made up of 3 segments that are enlarged and grouped together. And in most insects, you can't see that they are originally separate. In some, you can. And then 11 segments make up the abdomen. And again, not all of those are going to be visible from the outside. But the point is that different groupings of segments form these larger functional units called tagmata. And the ability to do this has led to the evolution of a very large number of body plans. This is what makes arthropods so diverse, is that there's so many ways that this simple plan can evolve. There's a lot you can do with it. So, for example, in scorpions, there's actually 6 segments that make up the head. It's actually called the prosoma. The head has all of the walking legs and the jaws and the claws growing off of it. The head is kind of trapezoid shaped. And then behind the head, 6 segments make up the mesosoma. And then 6 more behind that, plus the sting, which for technical reasons isn't considered a segment, make up the metasoma. And these don't really have appendages on them. Well, some traces, but never mind. What I want you to see is that this scorpion has a particular pattern of tagmosis, which is different from what you get in crustaceans, like this California spiny lobster, who's got 5 segments making up his head, not 6. So you can see the head, or the cephalothorax, is kind of gray spotted with red. It's the part that all of the walking legs and the antennae and the mouth parts, although you can't really see those, all of those are attached to the cephalothorax. And then the segmented part behind it is the abdomen, and that has specialized appendages of its own. Many arthropods have appendages that fork. Forked appendages like this are called biramus. There's an upper fork called the exopod and a lower fork called an endopod. But they both come from the same basal segment, the same joint. You see this in crustaceans a lot. You see traces of it in horseshoe crabs and things like that. But insects have uniramus appendages, meaning their appendages don't fork. This is significant because in many aquatic arthropods, one branch of each appendage forms a gill. You're looking at a diagrammatic cross-section through a crab. Down at the bottom, you have the basal joint of the leg, and you can see some leg segments sticking down into the lower left. But branching from that basal segment, you have something that's you can't really tell from the picture, but in life, it's very flexible. It's very thin. The cuticle is really, really thin. And it's kept tucked up in a special chamber under the carapace. You would not normally see this thing sticking out unless the crab was severely injured, or unless you were dissecting it or something like that. Water flows into that chamber and passes over the gills. So you're seeing a gill here, and the gill is a branch of the leg. A gill is the exopod of the leg, and the actual walking leg, the endopod, is what the thing walks on. You get the same pattern in crawfish and lobsters and things like that as well. The legs are biramus, but one of the branches is tucked into a special chamber, does not normally come out of there, and it's used for respiration. So that's another way that the arthropods have a very flexible body plan. They can use the different branches of their appendages for different functions. Insects don't breathe this way, but insects, and through convergent evolution in mites and millipedes, there's little holes in the sides of the body called spiracles, and those lead into air tubes called the tracheae. You would have seen, probably everybody would have seen at least some tracheas when you were looking at your cockroach guts. I know I pointed them out to several people in that first lab, that there were these branching, kind of grayish looking tubes. If you looked really carefully, you could see that the tubes were annulated, had little ring-shaped ornaments on them, kind of like vacuum cleaner hoses. Those were the spiracles, or those were the tracheae, and what opens into the spiracles are holes in the sides. Man, I'm tired. There are holes in the sides called spiracles, and the spiracles lead to branching air-bearing tubes that carry oxygen to all parts of the body, called the tracheae. There, I finally got it. Sorry. Man. Yes, hello, Fern. Good kitty. Right. In a group called the chelicerates, this includes the arachnids and also the horseshoe crabs. This is one of them. This thing looks a little bit weird, but it's perfectly harmless, and they live in the Gulf of Mexico and up the Atlantic coast of North America. There's also some species in Southeast Asia. And if you turn one of these over, the front part of the body, the prosoma, has 6 pairs of appendages, and you can see them kicking up right there. The frontmost pair is a little pair of claws that surrounds the actual mouth, and it may not be easy to see, but the other 5 pairs are pretty large. And then in the posterior half of the body, the walking branches have gone, and the exopods form what are called book gills. The head is pointing towards the lower left, so if you look at the upper right, there's a long spine on the tail called the telson, which this thing is using to try to turn itself over. But before you get to the spine, you can see what look like a bunch of flaps, one on top of the other. That's called the book gills. And in spiders and scorpions, they retain those book gills, but they cover them up with a flap of exoskeleton, creating something called a book lung. Down at the lower right, where you see that number 1, there's an opening that's also called a spiracle, and it leads directly into the book lung chamber, not into tracheas, as is the case in insects. And inside that book lung chamber, you have a whole bunch of very soft, flat sheets of tissue, giving you a great deal of surface area to take up oxygen and give off carbon dioxide. So different adaptations for breathing in different arthropod groups. Okay, so what are the major arthropod groups? Here's our roadmap for most of the rest of the course. Chelicerata is the arthropod group that includes spiders and scorpions, and amblypygiids. You know what an amblypygiid is because in the movie version of Harry Potter and, which one was it? It's the one where Bartemius Crouch teaches defense against the dark arts in the guise of Mad-Eye Mooney. And in the movie, he's demonstrating the unforgivable curses on this weird thing that looks like a spider and makes these awful screeching noises. So he demonstrates Imperio and then Crucio and then finally Avada Kedavra on this weird spider-looking thing. In the movie, that wasn't a spider. That belongs to a tropical group of chelicerates called the amblypygiids that looks a little bit different from spiders. They did not make that up for the movie. And now I can't remember which flipping movie it was that had Bartemius Crouch, the Death Eater, in the guise of Mad-Eye Moody, teaching the unforgivable curses in defense against the dark arts. You probably know. I don't remember. Anyway, In addition to spiders and scorpions and amblypygiids and a whole bunch of others, a group called the Acari includes mites, many of which are free-living, but there's also parasitic mites, including the mites that cause scabies in humans and mange in domestic animals. The Acari also includes the ticks. And anybody who has stepped outside in Arkansas in the summer for more than 2 minutes is familiar with ticks. The Myriapoda is centipedes and millipedes, and they don't seem to have any parasitic members that I know of. The Crustacea is probably the most delicious one, because that includes crabs and shrimp and crawfish and lobster. But there's several groups of parasites within the Crustacea. A very strange one called the Pentastomata is affectionately known as tongueworms. They don't infect humans, as far as I know. Maybe rarely they would, but they tend to live in habitats like snake lungs, because somebody's got to. The copepods is a very diverse group with a lot of free-living members, but there's also parasitic copepods. A completely parasitic group called the Branchiura we can actually find in Arkansas. We didn't see any in our fish necropsy lab, but they do turn up. The common name for these is fish lice, although they're not true lice. True lice are insects. There's many parasitic isopods. Isopoda, the ones you know, include the roly-polies on land. There's lots of marine isopods that are free-living, but there are parasites as well. And then even the barnacles, which are entirely marine, includes many free-living species, but there's actually some parasites. A very long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, I actually co-authored a scientific paper on a parasitic barnacle from the Antarctic called Analasma squalicola. Check it out sometime. It's a good paper from 1994. Right. And then Hexapoda is the group that includes insects in their kin. Lots of orders within the Hexapoda. The big parasite ones are Siphonaptera is the fleas. Anopleura and Malophaga are the lice. Anopleura for sucking lice and Malophaga for chewing lice. The ones that could conceivably live on your head are sucking lice. Malophaga can bite people, but they don't live permanently on them. Birds, on the other hand, they're very common. Strepsiptera is a really strange group called the twisted wing parasites, with a life cycle that you won't believe. Diptera includes the flies, and there's lots of micropredators, of course, mosquitoes and horseflies and black flies and all of that. But there's also some more permanent parasites, like bot flies, for example. Bot flies lay eggs on cattle, and the larvae crawl underneath the cattle's skin and can actually develop there for a long time. And they're cause pretty severe pain and damage. Bot flies can live in other critters too. There's even a human bot fly where the larvae develop under the skin of a host vertebrate. Hippoboscidae, aka keds, are the keds that I know are parasites of sheep that also live, under the skin and can cause pretty severe damage. And then wasps, bees, and ants include parasitoid wasps, the wasps that the movie Alien was based on, that lay their eggs in hosts, and the eggs hatch into larvae that devour the host from the inside out. Those would technically be parasitoids, not parasites, because they always kill their hosts. And you can find even some more groups that have some parasitic members, or might have parasitic larvae, but have free-living adults. And we'll get to all of those. And I have actually gone a tiny bit over time, so I'm going to go ahead and stop recording